The Battle of the Bulge was a major German offensive campaign launched through the densely forested Ardennes region of Wallonia in Belgium, France, and Luxembourg on the Western Front toward the end of World War II in Europe. The surprise attack caught the Allied forces completely off guard. United States forces bore the brunt of the attack and incurred the highest casualties for any operation during the war. The battle also severely depleted Germany's armored forces on the Western Front, and Germany was largely unable to replace them. German personnel, and later Luftwaffe aircraft, also sustained heavy losses. Different forces referred to the battle by different names. The Germans referred to it officially as Unternehmung am Rhein, usually Ardennen offensive or Rundstedt offensive, while the French named it the Bataille des Ardennes. The Allies called it the Ardennes counteroffensive. The phrase Battle of the Bulge was coined by contemporary press to describe the way the Allied front line bulged inward on wartime news maps and became the most widely used name for the battle. The German offensive was supported by several subordinate actions, including Operations Unternehmend Bodenplatte, Grief and Wirung, as well as stopping Allied transport over the Channel to the port city of Antwerp. These operations were intended to split the British and American Allied line in half, so the Germans could then proceed to encircle and destroy four Allied armies, forcing the Western Allies to negotiate a peace treaty in the Axis powers' favor. Once that was accomplished, Hitler could fully concentrate on the Eastern theater of war. The offensive was planned by the German forces with utmost secrecy, minimizing radio traffic and moving troops and equipment under cover of darkness. Intercepted German communications indicating a substantial German offensive preparation were not acted upon by the Allies. The Germans achieved total surprise on the morning of the 16th of December 1944 due to a combination of Allied overconfidence, preoccupation with Allied offensive plans, and poor aerial reconnaissance. The Germans attacked a weakly defended section of the Allied line, taking advantage of heavily overcast weather conditions, which grounded the Allies' overwhelmingly superior air forces. Fierce resistance on the northern shoulder of the offensive around Elsenborn Ridge and in the south around Bastogne blocked German access to key roads to the northwest and west that they counted on for success. Columns of armor and infantry that were supposed to advance along parallel routes found themselves on the same roads. This and terrain that favored the defenders threw the German advance behind schedule and allowed the Allies to reinforce the thinly placed troops. Improved weather conditions permitted air attacks on German forces and supply lines, which sealed the failure of the offensive. In the wake of the defeat, many experienced German units were left severely depleted of men and equipment. As survivors retreated to the defenses of the Siegfried Line, the Germans' initial attack included 406,000 men, 1,214 tanks, tank destroyers and assault guns, and 4,224 artillery pieces. These were reinforced a couple weeks later, bringing the offensive's total strength to around 450,000 troops. Between 67,200 and 125,000 of the men were killed, missing or wounded. For the Americans, with 610,000 involved in the battle, of whom 89,000 were casualties, including up to 19,000 killed. It was the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States in World War II. Background: after the breakout from Normandy at the end of July 1944 and the Allied landings in southern France on the 15th of August 1944, the Allies advanced toward Germany more quickly than anticipated. The Allies were faced with several military logistics issues. Troops were fatigued by weeks of continuous combat, supply lines were stretched extremely thin, and supplies were dangerously depleted. General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his staff chose to hold the Ardennes region, which was occupied by the U.S. First Army. The Allies believed the Ardennes could be defended by as few troops as possible due to the favorable terrain and the limited number of Allied operational objectives. Also, the Wehrmacht was known to be using the area to the east across the German border as a rest and refit area for its troops. The speed of the Allied advance, coupled with an initial lack of deep water ports, presented the Allies with enormous supply problems. Over-the-beach supply operations using the Normandy landing areas and direct landing LSDs on the beaches were unable to meet operational needs. The only deep water port the Allies had captured was Cherbourg on the northern shore of the Cotentin Peninsula and west of the original invasion beaches, but the Germans had thoroughly wrecked and mined the harbor before it could be taken. It took many months to rebuild its cargo handling capability. The Allies captured the port of Antwerp intact in the first days of September, but it was not operational until the 28th of November. The estuary of the Schelde River that controlled access to the port had to be cleared of both German troops and naval mines. The limitations led to differences between General Eisenhower and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of the Anglo-Canadian 21st Army Group, over whether Montgomery or Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. 12th Army Group in the south, would get priority access to supplies. German forces remained in control of several major ports on the English Channel coast until May 1945. The extensive destruction of the French railway system prior to D-Day, successful in hampering German response to the invasion, proved equally damaging to the Allies, as it took time to repair the system's tracks and bridges. A trucking system nicknamed the Red Bull Express brought supplies to frontline troops, but used up 5 times as much fuel to reach the front line near the Belgian border as was delivered. By early October, the Allies had suspended major offensives to improve the supply lines and availability. Montgomery and Bradley both pressed for priority delivery of supplies to their respective armies so they could continue their individual lines of advance and maintain pressure on the Germans. Eisenhower, however, preferred a broad front strategy. He gave some priority to Montgomery's northern forces, which had the short-term goal of opening the urgently needed port of Antwerp and the long-term goal of capturing the Ruhr area, the biggest industrial area of Germany. With the Allies stalled, German General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt was able to reorganize the disrupted German armies into a coherent defense. Field Marshal Montgomery's Operation Market Garden only achieved some of its objectives, while its territorial gains left the Allied supply situation stretched further than before. In October, the 1st Canadian Army fought the Battle of the Scheldt, opening the port of Antwerp to shipping. As a result, by the end of October the supply situation had eased somewhat. Despite a lull along the front after the Scheldt battles, the German situation remained dire. While operations continued in the autumn, notably the Lorraine campaign, the Battle of Aachen and fighting in the Hürtgen forest, the strategic situation in the west had changed little. The Allies were slowly pushing towards Germany, but no decisive breakthrough was achieved. The Western Allies already had 96 divisions at or near the front, with an estimated 10 more divisions en route from the United Kingdom. Additional Allied airborne units remained in England. the Germans could field a total of 55 understrength divisions. Adolf Hitler promised his generals a total of 18 infantry and 12 armored or mechanized divisions for planning purposes. The plan was to pull 13 infantry divisions, 2 parachute divisions and 6 panzer-type divisions from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht Strategic Reserve. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets' Operation Bagration during the summer had destroyed much of Germany's Army Group Center. The extremely swift operation ended only when the advancing Soviet Red Army forces outran the supplies. By November, it was clear that Soviet forces were preparing for a winter offensive. Meanwhile, the Allied air offensive of early 1944 had effectively grounded the Luftwaffe, leaving the German army with little battlefield intelligence and no way to interdict Allied supplies. The converse was equally damaging. Daytime movement of German forces was almost instantly noticed, and interdiction of supplies combined with the bombing of the Romanian oil fields starved Germany of oil and gasoline. One of the few advantages held by the German forces in November 1944 was that they were no longer defending all of Western Europe. The front lines in the west had been considerably shortened by the Allied offensive and were much closer to the German heartland. This drastically reduced the supply problems despite Allied control of the air. Additionally, their extensive telephone and telegraph network meant that radios were no longer necessary for communications, which lessened the effectiveness of Allied ultra-intercepts. Nevertheless, some 40 to 50 messages per day were decrypted by Ultra. They recorded the quadrupling of German fighter forces, and a term used in an intercepted Luftwaffe message, Jägeraufmarsch, implied preparation for an offensive operation. Ultra also picked up communiques regarding extensive rail and road movements in the region, as well as orders that movements should be made on time. Drafting the offensive, the German leader, Adolf Hitler, felt that his mobile reserves allowed him to mount one major offensive. Although he realized nothing significant could be accomplished in the Eastern Front, he still believed an offensive against the Western Allies, whom he considered militarily inferior to the Red Army, would have some chances of success. Hitler believed he could split the Allied forces and compel the Americans and British to settle for a separate peace, independent of the Soviet Union. Success in the West would give the Germans time to design and produce more advanced weapons and permit the concentration of forces in the East. After the war ended, this assessment was generally viewed as unrealistic, given Allied air superiority throughout Europe and their ability to continually disrupt German offensive operations. Given the reduced manpower of the land forces at the time, the Germans believed the best way to seize the initiative would be to attack in the west against the smaller Allied forces rather than against the vast Soviet armies. Even the encirclement and destruction of multiple Soviet armies like in 1941 would still have left the Soviets with a numerical superiority. Several senior German military officers, including Field Marshals Walter Model and Gerd von Rundstedt, expressed concern as to whether the goals of the offensive could be realized. They offered alternative plans, but Hitler would not listen. The plan banked on unfavorable weather, including heavy fog and low-lying clouds, which would minimize the Allied air advantage. Hitler originally set the offensive for late November, before the anticipated start of the Russian winter offensive. In the West, supply problems began significantly to impede Allied operations. Even though the opening of the port of Antwerp in late November improved the situation somewhat. The positions of the Allied armies stretched from southern France all the way north to the Netherlands. German planning for the counteroffensive rested on the premise that a successful strike against thinly manned stretches of the line would halt Allied advances on the entire Western Front. Model and von Rundstedt both believed aiming for Antwerp was too ambitious, given Germany's scarce resources in late 1944. At the same time, they felt that maintaining a purely defensive posture would only delay defeat, not avert it. They thus developed alternative, less ambitious plans that did not aim to cross the Meuse River, models being Antonin Herbst-Nebel and von Rundstedt's Full Martin. The two field marshals combined the plans to present a joint, small solution to Hitler. A second plan called for a classic blitzkrieg attack through the weakly defended Ardennes, mirroring the successful German offensive during the Battle of France in 1940, aimed at splitting the armies along the U.S. British lines and capturing Antwerp. Hitler chose the second plan, believing a successful encirclement would have little impact on the overall situation and finding the prospect of splitting the Anglo-American armies more appealing. The disputes between Montgomery and Bradley were well known, and Hitler hoped he could exploit this disunity. If the attack were to succeed in capturing Antwerp, 4 complete armies would be trapped without supplies behind German lines. Both plans centered on attacks against the American forces. Tasked with carrying out the operation were General Feldmarschall Walther Model, the commander of German Army Group B, and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander of the German Army Command in the West, who had moved his base of operations to Kranzberg Castle. Operation names. The Wehrmacht's code name for the offensive was Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, after the German patriotic hymn Die Wacht am Rhein, a name that deceptively implied the Germans would be adopting a defensive posture along the Western Front. The Germans also referred to it as Ardennen Offensive and Rundstedt Offensive, both names being generally used nowadays in modern Germany. The French name for the operation is Bataille des Ardennes. The battle was militarily defined by the Allies as the Ardennes counteroffensive, which included the German drive and the American effort to contain and later defeat it. The phrase Battle of the Bulge was coined by contemporary press to describe the way the Allied front line bulged inward on wartime news maps. While the Ardennes counteroffensive is the correct term in Allied military language, the official Ardennes-Alsace campaign reached beyond the Ardennes battle region, and the most popular description in English-speaking countries remains simply the Battle of the Bulge. Planning the OKW decided by mid-September, at Hitler's insistence, that the offensive would be mounted in the Ardennes, as was done in 1940. Many German generals objected, but the offensive was planned and carried out anyway. In 1940, German forces had passed through the Ardennes in 3 days before engaging the enemy, but the 1944 plan called for battle in the forest itself. The main forces were to advance westward to the Meuse River, then turn northwest for Antwerp and Brussels. The close terrain of the Ardennes would make rapid movement difficult, though open ground beyond the Meuse offered the prospect of a successful dash to the coast. 4 armies were selected for the operation. First was the 6th Panzer Army, under SSSS Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich. It had been created on the 26th of October 1944 and incorporated the most senior and the experienced formation of the Waffen-SS. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler as well as the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. The 6th Panzer Army was designated the northernmost attack force, having its northernmost point on the pre-attack battlefront nearest the German town of Monschau. It was entrusted with the offensive's primary objective, capturing Antwerp. The 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel was assigned to the middle attack route with the objective of capturing Brussels. The 7th Army under General Erich Brandenberger was assigned to the southernmost attack, having its southernmost point on the pre-attack battlefront nearest the Luxembourgish city of Ardennes, with the task of protecting the flank. This army was made up of only 4 infantry divisions, with no large-scale armored formations to use as a spearhead unit. As a result, they made little progress throughout the battle. Also participating in a secondary role was the 15th Army under General Gustav Adolf von Zengen, recently brought back up to strength and re-equipped after heavy fighting during Market Garden. It was located on the far north of the Ardennes battlefield and tasked with holding U.S. forces in place, with the possibility of launching its own attack given favorable conditions. For the offensive to be successful, 4 criteria were deemed critical. The attack had to be a complete surprise, the weather conditions had to be poor to neutralize Allied air superiority and the damage it could inflict on the German offensive and its supply lines. The progress had to be rapid. The Meuse River, halfway to Antwerp, had to be reached by day 4, and Allied fuel supplies would have to be captured intact along the way because the combined Wehrmacht forces were short on fuel. The General Staff estimated they only had enough fuel to cover 1/3 to 1/2 of the ground to Antwerp in heavy combat conditions. The plan originally called for just under 45 divisions, including a dozen Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions forming the armored spearhead and various infantry units to form a defensive line as the battle unfolded. By this time, however, the German army suffered from an acute manpower shortage and the force had been reduced to around 30 divisions. Although it retained most of its armor, there were not enough infantry units because of the defensive needs in the east. These 30 newly rebuilt divisions used some of the last reserves of the German army. Among them were Volksgrenadier units formed from a mix of battle-hardened veterans and recruits formerly regarded as too young, too old or too frail to fight. Training time, equipment and supplies were inadequate during the preparations. German fuel supplies were precarious. Those materials and supplies that could not be directly transported by rail had to be horse-drawn to conserve fuel, and the mechanized and panzer divisions would depend heavily on captured fuel. As a result, the start of the offensive was delayed from the 27th of November to the 16th of December. Before the offensive, the Allies were virtually blind to German troop movement. During the liberation of France, the extensive network of the French resistance had provided valuable intelligence about German dispositions. Once they reached the German border, this source dried up. In France, orders had been relayed within the German army using radio messages enciphered by the Enigma machine, and these could be picked up and decrypted by Allied code breakers headquartered at Bletchley Park to give the intelligence known as Ultra. In Germany, such orders were typically transmitted using telephone and teleprinter, and a special radio silence order was imposed on all matters concerning the upcoming offensive. The major crackdown in the Wehrmacht after the 20th of July plot to assassinate Hitler resulted in much tighter security and fewer leaks. The foggy autumn weather also prevented Allied reconnaissance aircraft from correctly assessing the ground situation. German units assembling in the area were even issued charcoal instead of wood for cooking fires to cut down on smoke and reduce chances of Allied observers deducing a troop build-up was underway. For these reasons, Allied High Command considered the Ardennes a quiet sector, relying on assessments from their intelligence intelligence services that the Germans were unable to launch any major offensive operations this late in the war. What little intelligence they had led the Allies to believe precisely what their Germans wanted them to believe, that preparations were being carried out only for defensive, not offensive, operations. The Allies relied too much on ultra, not human reconnaissance. In fact, because of the Germans' efforts, the Allies were led to believe that a new defensive army was being formed around Düsseldorf in the northern Rhineland, possibly to defend against British attack. This was done by increasing the number of flak in the area and the artificial multiplication of radio transmissions in the area. The Allies at this point thought the information was of no importance. All of this meant that the attack, when it came, completely surprised the Allied forces. Remarkably, the U.S. Third Army Intelligence Chief, Colonel Oscar Koch, the U.S. First Army Intelligence Chief and the Chief Intelligence Officer Brigadier General Kenneth Strong all correctly predicted the German offensive capability and intention to strike the U.S. 8th Corps area. These predictions were largely dismissed by the U.S. 12th Army Group. Strong had informed Bedell Smith in December of his suspicions. Bedell Smith sent Strong to warn Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, the commander of the 12th Army Group, of the danger. Bradley's response was succinct: "Let them come." Historian Patrick K. O'Donnell writes that on the 8th of December 1944, U.S. Rangers at great cost took Hill 400 during the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest. The next day, GIs who relieved the Rangers reported a considerable movement of German troops inside the Ardennes in the enemy's rear, but that no one in the chain of command connected the dots, because the Ardennes was considered a quiet sector. Economy of force considerations led it to be used as a training ground for new units and a rest area for units that had seen hard fighting. The U.S. units deployed in the Ardennes thus were a mixture of inexperienced troops and battle-hardened troops sent to that sector to recuperate. Two major special operations were planned for the offensive. By October it was decided that Otto Skorzeny, the German SS commander who had rescued the former Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, was to lead a task force of English-speaking German soldiers in Operation Grief. These soldiers were to be dressed in American and British uniforms and wear dog tags taken from corpses and POWs. Their job was to go behind American lines and change signposts, misdirect traffic, generally cause disruption, and seize bridges across the Meuse River between Liege and Namur. By late November, another ambitious special operation was added. Col. Friedrich August von der Heydte was to lead a Fallschirmjäger Kampfgruppe in Operation Stosser, a nighttime paratroop drop behind the Allied lines aimed at capturing a vital road junction near Malmedy. German intelligence had set the 20th of December as the expected date for the start of the upcoming Soviet offensive, aimed at crushing what was left of German resistance on the Eastern Front and thereby opening the way to Berlin. It was hoped that Soviet leader Stalin would delay the start of the operation once the German assault in the Ardennes had begun and wait for the outcome before continuing. After the 20th of July plot attempt on Hitler's life, and the close advance of the Red Army which would seize the site on the 27th of January 1945, Hitler and his staff had been forced to abandon the Wolfschanz headquarters in East Prussia, in which they had coordinated much of the fighting on the Eastern Front. After a brief visit to Berlin, Hitler traveled on his Ferris and Zug to Gießen on the 11th of December, taking up residence in the Adlerhorst Command Complex, co-located with Oberst's base at Kranzberg Castle. Believing in omens and the successes of his early war campaigns that had been planned at Kranzberg, Hitler had chosen the site from which he had overseen the successful 1940 campaign against France and the Low Countries. Von Rundstedt set up his operational headquarters near Limburg, close enough for the generals and Panzer Corps commanders who were to lead the attack to visit Adlerhorst on the 11th of December, traveling there in an SS-operated bus convoy, with the castle acting as overflow accommodation. The main party was settled into the Adlerhorst's House 2 command bunker, including Gen. Alfred Jodl, Gen. Wilhelm Keitel, Gen. Blumentritt von Menteufel and SS Gen. Joseph Dietrich von Rundstedt then ran through the battle plan, while Hitler made one of his endless speeches, in a personal conversation on the 13th of December between war.The model and Friedrich von der Heyte, who was put in charge of Operation Stosse. Von der Heyte gave Operation Stosse less than a 10% chance of succeeding. Model told him it was necessary to make the attempt. It must be done because this offensive is the last chance to conclude the war favorably.